She crouched behind the sheriff's desk, trembling hands clutching stolen medicine, when footsteps echoed through the office. Caught red-handed, she expected handcuffs, prison, the end of everything. But when their eyes met, something impossible happened. Instead of arrest, he whispered 3 words that changed both their lives forever. Take what you need. What could drive a desperate woman to steal from the one man sworn to uphold the law? And why couldn't he bring himself to punish her when he discovered the heartbreaking truth? If you're ready for a story that will completely shatter your expectations, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. This tale of forbidden compassion and impossible choices is about to begin. The dust settled like grief in the corners of Sheriff Wyatt Kane's office, where Eliza Hartwell crouched behind his desk, her fingers trembling around a tin of hardtack and a bottle of laudanum. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her like accusing fingers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a bird trapped in a cage too small, too fragile. She had not meant to become a thief. The words sat bitter on her tongue, foreign as the taste of desperation that had driven her here. But Thomas lay fevered in their hiding place beyond the canyon, his small body burning with sickness, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The floorboards creaked. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, crystallizing into silence. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority she had learned to fear. Her fingers tightened around the stolen goods, knuckles white as bone. "I know you're there." The voice was gentler than she expected, rough around the edges like weathered stone, but lacking the harsh judgment she braced herself for. Slowly, she rose from behind the desk, emerging like a ghost from shadows, her dark hair falling across her face like a veil. Sheriff Kane stood in the doorway, his hand resting not on his gun, but on the doorframe, as if anchoring himself to something solid. His eyes, the color of winter sky, took in her slight frame, the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the medicine clutched in her desperate grasp. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the facade of authority. "Please," she whispered, the word escaping before she could cage it. "He's dying." Time suspended itself between them like morning mist, fragile and trembling. Eliza watched the sheriff's face, searching for the hardness she expected, the cold calculation that would seal her fate. Instead, she found something unexpected, a recognition that made her chest tighten with dangerous hope. "Who's dying?" His voice carried no judgment, only careful curiosity. "My brother." The words fell from her lips like stones into still water, sending ripples through the silence. "Thomas, he's only 8, and the fever." Her voice cracked, splintering along old fault lines of grief. Wyatt Kane studied her with eyes that seemed to see too much. The badge on his chest caught the fading light, a star of responsibility that should have made him her enemy. But his hands remained steady at his sides, offering no threat. "Where is he?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications she dared not voice. To answer would be to trust, a currency she had learned was too dangerous to spend. Yet something in his stillness spoke of safety, of harbors in storms she had weathered alone for too long. "Beyond the Red Canyon, there's a cave." She stopped, herself, lips pressed tight against further confession. Wyatt nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he already knew. "How long has he been sick?" 3 days. The admission tasted like surrender. "Maybe 4, I've lost count." He moved then, not toward her, but to the window, where he stood looking out at the dust-painted street. His profile was sharp as carved wood, weathered by sun and responsibility. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decision already made. "Take what you need." Eliza stared at the sheriff's back, certain she had misheard. The medicine felt heavy in her hands, heavier still with the possibility of reprieve. But gifts, she had learned, always carried hidden costs. "I don't understand." Wyatt turned from the window, and she saw something raw in his expression. A vulnerability quickly shuttered, but not quickly enough to hide from eyes trained to catch such glimpses of humanity. "I had a brother once. The words emerged quietly, as if speaking them too loudly might shatter something precious. Fever took him when I was about your age. I know what it's like to watch someone you love slip away, to feel helpless against something you can't fight with fists or guns. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Eliza felt something shift inside her chest. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. A crack in the wall she had built around her heart. Why, she asked, needing to understand this unexpected mercy. Because sometimes the law and what's right aren't the same thing. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, coins clinking softly inside, for whatever else he might need, food, blankets. Eliza shook her head, stepping back as if the kindness might burn her. I can't. You can. You will. His voice carried gentle authority, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but choosing to ask instead of demand. Her child's life is worth more than my pride or your shame. She looked down at the medicine in her hands, then at the money he offered. Two gifts that represented more than charity. They represented faith in her worthiness to receive them. The thought made her throat tight with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for the magnitude of what he offered. Wyatt stepped closer, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. What's your name? Eliza. It felt strange to speak her own name after so long hiding in the shadows. Eliza Hartwell. Eliza. He repeated it like a prayer, giving weight to her existence in a world that had tried to erase her. I'm Wyatt, and you're not alone anymore. 3 days passed like whispered prayers before Eliza returned to town. She moved through the early morning streets like a ghost, her feet knowing paths that avoided curious eyes and wagging tongues. Thomas slept peacefully for the first time in a week, the fever broken, color returning to his pale cheeks. But peace was a luxury that felt foreign in her hands, too precious to trust. She found herself drawn to the sheriff's office, not for what she could take, but for what she might offer. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply the assurance that his faith had not been misplaced. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, she heard voices, male voices rough with authority and suspicion. Someone's been helping themselves to your supplies, Kane. The speaker's tone carried accusation like a loaded gun. Food missing, medicine gone. You running a charity now. Eliza pressed herself against the building's wall, heart hammering with familiar fear. Through the window, she could see 2 men. Inside, strangers with the look of officials about them, their presence carrying the weight of judgment. I keep track of my own inventory. Wyatt's voice was steady, betraying nothing. Everything's accounted for. Town council's been asking questions. People are nervous about vagrants, thieves. They want to know their sheriff's handling the problem. The word thief struck Eliza like a physical blow. That's what she was in their eyes. Not a sister fighting for family, not a daughter orphaned by tragedy, but simply a thief. The label felt like a brand burned into her skin. I'll handle any problems that arise, Wyatt said, his tone final. See that you do. This town's got a reputation to maintain. Eliza slipped away before the men could emerge, their words echoing in her mind like tolling bells. She had brought trouble to the one person who had shown her kindness. The thought sat heavy in her chest, a stone of guilt she couldn't swallow. The town felt different now, charged with an awareness that made Eliza's skin prickle. Eyes followed her movements, shopkeepers pausing in their work, women gathering their children. Closer when she passed. Word had spread, as it always did in small places where secrets were currency and suspicion, a form of entertainment. She found Wyatt at the general store, his tall frame bent over the counter as he spoke quietly with the proprietor. When he saw her, something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that spoke of protective instincts awakening. Miss Hartwell. His greeting was formal, professional, but his eyes held warmth meant only for her. How's your brother? Better. Much better. She kept her voice low, aware of the store owner's interested gaze. Thank you. Good to hear. Wyatt touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that seemed casual but felt like a benediction. "Take care of yourself." It was dismissal and protection rolled into one, public distance to shield them both from scrutiny. But as she turned to leave, she felt the press of something small and hard into her palm. A key. Outside, she examined his gift in the shelter of an alley. Brass, worn smooth by countless hands, attached to a small tag that read simply, "Back. Door after dark." The invitation terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. It spoke of continued kindness, but also of dangerous proximity to a man whose reputation she could destroy simply by existing in his orbit. That evening she stood, at the back of the sheriff's office, as shadows pooled like spilled ink in the corners of the world. The key turned easily in the lock, and she slipped inside to find Wyatt waiting at his desk, a plate of food and a pot of coffee set between two chairs. "You came," he said, and she heard relief in his voice. "I shouldn't have." But she closed, the door behind her sealing them into the intimacy of shared secrets. "Probably not." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "But I'm glad you did." They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks, careful meetings in the sanctuary of his office after the town had surrendered to sleep. Eliza would slip through the back door like a prayer whispered in darkness, and Wyatt would be waiting with food, medicine, sometimes just company for her solitary hours. They spoke little at first, communication built on gestures and glances rather than words. He would push the coffee cup toward her, and she would accept it like communion. She would place wildflowers from the canyon on his desk, and he would leave them there until they dried to delicate husks, beautiful in their fragility. "Tell me about Thomas," he said one night, breaking their comfortable silence. Eliza's hands stilled on the cup she held. Thomas was the most precious thing in her world, and sharing him felt like offering up her heart for inspection. "He's brave," she said finally. "Braver than me. When our parents died, he cried for one night, then asked what we were going to do next. As if he trusted me to have all the answers." "How old were you?" 17. The number felt impossibly young now, though only 2 years had passed. Old enough to know I didn't know anything, but too proud to admit it. Wyatt's eyes held understanding that went beyond words. What happened to them? The question she had dreaded and expected. The wound that defined her, shaped her into someone who stole medicine in desperate hours and trusted no one until a sheriff with winter eyes had shown her mercy. Raiders. The word tasted like ash. They came through our settlement. Took what they wanted. My parents tried to protect us, hid us in the root cellar. By the time it was over. She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Wyatt's face told her he understood the mathematics of loss, the calculations that left children orphaned and families scattered like leaves in harsh wind. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried weight because they came from someone who knew the shape of such sorrows. "Thomas doesn't remember much. I'm grateful for that." She looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "But sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, running instead of staying to bury them, properly." "You saved his life and your own." Wyatt's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "That's what they would have wanted." Autumn arrived like a whispered secret, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and amber. Eliza found herself collecting small treasures during her daily wanderings, smooth stones, feathers shed by passing birds, leaves pressed between the pages of an old book she'd found abandoned in the ruins of her family home. She began leaving these offerings on Wyatt's desk during their evening meetings, wordless gifts that spoke of gratitude too large for language. He, in turn, left small tokens for her, a book of poetry with pages marked by careful fingers, a woolen scarf soft as clouds, a tin whistle that sang sweet melodies when the wind caught it just right. "I found something," he said one evening, his voice carrying unusual hesitancy. From his desk drawer, he withdrew a small wooden carving, a gaga horse in mid-gallop, its mane flowing like captured wind. Eliza's breath caught. She knew that carving, had watched her father's hands shape it during long winter evenings, his knife patient and sure as he brought wood to life. "Where?" she began, but her throat closed around the words. "The old Morrison place where your family lived. I rode out there last week, thought maybe—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I thought you might want something to remember them by." She took the carving with trembling hands, feeling the familiar grooves. Her father's fingers had worn smooth. It was more than wood and memory. It was proof that she had belonged somewhere once, that her family had existed in more than just the architecture of grief she carried. "Thank you," she whispered, but the words felt insufficient. "How do you thank someone for returning a piece of your heart?" Wyatt's fingers brushed hers as she cradled the carving, the touch light as falling leaves but electric with unspoken meaning. "You don't have to thank me, Eliza. We take care of each other. That's what people do." The simple statement cracked something open inside her chest. People, as if she belonged to that category, as if she deserved care and consideration simply by virtue of existing. The thought was revolutionary, terrifying in its implications. Winter settled over the territory like a held breath, crisp and sharp and full of anticipation. Thomas grew stronger each day, his laughter ringing through their cave hideout like music. But Eliza found herself increasingly torn between two worlds, the safe shadows where she and her brother existed, and the warm circle of lamplight in Wyatt's office, where she felt for brief, precious hours like she belonged somewhere. "You could stay," Wyatt said one evening, the words emerging quietly between them like a confession. "Both of you. I have a house, small but enough room. Thomas could go to school, have friends. You could—" He trailed off, but she knew what he hadn't said. She could stop hiding, stop running. Stop stealing through back doors and living on the margins of existence. The offer hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Not because she didn't want to, God, how she wanted to, but because bridges could burn, and she had Thomas to think about. "People would talk," she said finally. "Let them talk. They'd say terrible things. About me, about you, about what kind of woman lives under a sheriff's roof." Wyatt leaned forward, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "Tita, I don't care what they say. You should." Her voice was soft but firm. "You've worked too hard, built too much to lose it for someone like me." "Someone like you?" The words came out sharp, almost angry. "Someone brave enough to risk everything, for family. Someone who brings wildflowers to a lonely man's office and leaves them like hope on his desk. Someone who trusts me with her secrets and accepts my kindness without asking what it costs." His words painted a picture of herself, she barely recognized, not the thief, not the vagrant, but someone worthy of protection, of care, perhaps even of love. The thought made her chest tight with possibility and terror. "Wyatt, I know it's complicated, I know there are risks." He reached across the space between them, his fingers finding hers. "But I also know I've been half alive since you walked into this office, and I don't want to go back to that." The confession changed everything and nothing. They still met in careful secrecy, still shared coffee and quiet conversation, but now the air between them hummed with acknowledged feeling. Wyatt's eyes lingered on her face with new intensity, and Eliza found herself memorizing the way his hands moved when he spoke, the way his voice softened when he said her name. But with acknowledgement came complication. The town council increased their pressure, demanding results in the matter of vagrant problems. Mrs. Pemberton, the mayor's wife, made pointed comments about moral standards and proper behavior. Even the preacher found occasion to mention the evils of harboring strangers in his Sunday sermons. "They're watching you," Eliza said one evening. Noting the tension in Wyatt's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he thought she wasn't looking. "I know." He rubbed his forehead, suddenly looking older than his years. "Henderson from the council came by today. Said there's been complaints about my priorities." The word hung between them like an indictment. His priorities, choosing. Her well-being over public opinion, her brother's health over rigid law enforcement. "Maybe we should stop," she said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "These meetings, this, whatever this is between us. It's not fair to ask you to risk everything." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something fierce and determined. "Do you know what I was before I became sheriff?" he asked. She shook her head. A drifter, a man with no roots, no purpose, no reason to stay in one place longer than it took to earn enough for the next meal. He set down his cup with careful precision. This badge gave me something to be. But you gave me something to be it for. The words hit her like a physical force, knocking the breath from her lungs. Wyatt, I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm just asking you to know that whatever happens, however this ends, meeting you changed something in me that I didn't even know was broken. The crisis came, as crises do, when she least expected it. Eliza returned to town for their usual evening meeting to find strangers in the sheriff's office. Hard men with badges and authority, their presence filling the small space like smoke from a poorly tended fire. She watched from the alley as they questioned Wyatt, their voices carrying accusations she couldn't quite make out but understood in her bones. When they finally left, his face was set like stone, his shoulders carrying a burden that hadn't been there that morning. She waited until full darkness before using her key, slipping inside to find him standing at the window, staring out at the empty street. "They know," he said, without turning around. The words confirmed what she had already guessed. "What are you going to do?" "What I have to do." He faced her then, and she saw resignation in his eyes that made her heart clench with fear. "They want me to find the thief who's been taking supplies, make an example, show the town that law and order still mean something here. And if you refuse, they'll find someone who won't." His smile was bitter as winter wind. Henderson made that very clear. Eliza felt the walls closing in around them, the careful sanctuary they had built crumbling under the weight of other people's expectations. She had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like distant thunder, but she hadn't prepared for how much it would hurt. "I'll leave," she said quietly. "Tonight. Thomas and I will disappear, go somewhere new. They can't blame you for thieves who vanish like smoke." "No." The word came out sharp, absolute. "Running isn't the answer." "Then what is?" Her voice cracked with frustration and fear. "You can't protect me without destroying yourself, and I won't let you do that." Wyatt crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his hands framing her face with desperate gentleness. "Listen to me. I've spent my whole life following other people's rules, other people's definitions of right and wrong. But some things matter, more than badges and titles and what the town council thinks. Your career matters, your reputation. You matter." The words came out fierce, uncompromising. "You and Thomas, what we've built here between us, that matters more than anything else." She wanted to believe him, wanted to sink into the safety of his conviction, but the practical part of her mind calculated costs with ruthless clarity. "What if we're wrong?" she whispered. "What if this feeling between us isn't worth everything you'll lose? Then we'll figure it out together." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, gentle as a prayer. "But I won't send you away to protect a job that means nothing without someone to serve." The confrontation came 3 days later, not in shadows and whispers, but in the bright, merciless light of midday. Eliza had brought Thomas to town for the first time in months, a calculated risk, because he needed new boots before winter truly settled, and she couldn't bear to see him make do with shoes 2 sizes too small. They were leaving the cobbler's shop when Henderson and 2 other council members blocked their path. Behind them stood a small crowd of townspeople, drawn by the promise of drama unfolding in their orderly streets. "Well, well." Henderson's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had finally cornered his prey. "The mysterious vagrant everyone's been talking about, and with a child, no less." Thomas pressed closer to her side, his small hand finding hers with the instinctive trust that had sustained them through 2 years of hardship. She felt the weight of watching eyes, the town's collective judgment, settling on her shoulders like a yoke. "We're not causing any trouble," she said quietly, hoping to diffuse the situation before it escalated. "Aren't you?" Henderson's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Funny thing about trouble, it has a way of following certain kinds of people. The sheriff's been very interested in your welfare lately. Makes a person wonder what kind of arrangements you might have made." The implication hit her like a slap, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "That's enough, Henderson." Wyatt materialized beside her, his presence both protection and terrible exposure. In the harsh light of public scrutiny, their careful secrecy seemed foolish, naive. The town would see what it wanted to see, believe what it chose to believe. Sheriff Kane. Henderson's tone dripped with false courtesy. How convenient that you should arrive just as we're discussing our vagrant problem. Miss Hartwell isn't a vagrant. Wyatt's voice carried the authority of his office. But Eliza heard the cost of defending her in the careful control of his tone. She's a resident of this territory, same as anyone else. Is she? Henderson's eyes glittered with malicious intent. Strange, then, that no one seems to know where she lives, how she supports herself. Though perhaps you have insights the rest of us lack, the crowd murmured, a sound like wasps awakening. Eliza felt the moment crystallizing around them, choices narrowing to a single point of no return. I know Miss Hartwell because I make it my business to know the people in my territory. Wyatt's words were measured, professional, but Eliza heard the undercurrent of something deeper. She's been caring for her sick brother, working to keep their family together after tragedy struck. That makes her someone deserving of respect, not suspicion. Caring for him how? Henderson pressed. With what money? What resources? The boy looks well-fed, well-clothed. That takes more than charity provides. The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one designed to corner her further. Eliza felt Thomas's grip tighten on her. Hand felt the weight of his trust and her responsibility to protect him from the ugliness of adult prejudices. I work, she said quietly, lifting her chin with dignity she didn't entirely feel. I clean houses, mend clothes, tend gardens. I take what work I can find, and I pay my own way. It wasn't entirely true. Wyatt's kindness had supplemented her. Meager earnings more than she could repay. But it wasn't entirely false either. She had worked, had tried to maintain their independence, even when pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. For whom? Henderson demanded. Name one person who's employed you. The trap closed around her with cruel precision. Her work had been scattered, temporary, often performed for people who preferred not to acknowledge her existence once the job was done. She had no references, no proof of honest labor, only the desperate resourcefulness that had kept her and Thomas alive. Before she could answer, a voice spoke from the crowd. She mended my Sunday dress. Mrs. Garcia, the baker's wife, stepped forward with quiet dignity, did beautiful work too, invisible stitches like it was never torn. And she helped me tend my kitchen garden when my back went out, added old Mr. Peterson. Wouldn't take more than a meal in payment, though, I offered. More voices joined them, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Stories of small kindnesses, honest work performed with skill and grace. People Eliza barely remembered defending her to a crowd that had been ready to condemn. Henderson's face darkened with frustration as his narrative of criminality crumbled around him. But his next words carried venom born of thwarted authority. Pretty stories, but they don't explain everything. There's still the matter of missing supplies from the sheriff's office. Medicine, food, items that would be mighty tempting to someone with a sick child and no steady income. The accusation hung between them like a loaded gun, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Silence stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Eliza felt the town's attention focus on her with laser intensity, felt the weight of judgment and the terrible clarity of decision. She could deny Henderson's accusations. Let others shoulder the burden of proof, hide behind the protection Wyatt offered, or she could step into the light and claim her choices, whatever the cost. Yes, she said, the word dropping into silence like a stone into still water. I took medicine, food, what my brother needed to live. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Thomas's hand tightened in hers, but she felt his trust remain steady, unshakable. Beside her, Wyatt went very still, but she sensed no judgment from him, only a kind of fierce pride that made her chest tight with gratitude. I don't expect anyone to understand, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You all have homes, families, steady work. You've never had to choose between pride and survival, never had to watch someone you love suffering while you count coins you don't have. She looked directly at Henderson, meeting his satisfied gaze with unflinching honesty. I stole because The alternative was watching my brother die, and if I had to make that choice again, I'd make it the same way every time. There you have it, Henderson said, his voice thick with triumph. A confession. Sheriff Kane, you have your thief. All eyes turned to Wyatt, waiting for him to fulfill his duty, to arrest her and validate the town's faith in law and order. Eliza held her breath, knowing that whatever he chose in this moment would define not just their future, but the very core of who he was. Wyatt stepped forward, his movement deliberate and sure. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of his office, but something deeper, the authority of a man who had found his true north and refused to be turned from it. Miss Hartwell, he said formally, you've admitted to taking supplies from my office without permission. Yes, sir. She kept her voice steady, dignified. And you did this to provide medical care for your brother? Yes, sir. Wyatt nodded slowly, then reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather folder. He opened it carefully, removing a sheet of paper that he held up for the crowd to see. This is a receipt, he announced, for supplies. Purchased by Miss Hartwell from the territorial office, paid for with money earned through honest work. His eyes met hers across the space between them, and she saw something like amazement in their depths. There was no theft, because there was no taking without permission or payment. The lie was beautiful in its simplicity, impossible to disprove without examining records that didn't exist. But more than that, it was a choice, his choice to stand with her, to redefine truth in service of something larger than law. Henderson's face went purple with rage. That's impossible. She just confessed. She confessed to taking what she needed for her family, Wyatt interrupted calmly. She never said she stole it. The arrangement was private, conducted after hours to protect her privacy and dignity. 6 months later, Eliza stood in the doorway of the small house at the edge of town, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the twilight garden they had planted together. His laughter carried on the evening breeze, pure and bright as church bells, a sound that still filled her with wonder after so many years of careful quiet. The house was modest, 2 rooms and a kitchen with a porch that caught the morning, sun and windows that framed the distant mountains like paintings. But it was theirs, legally and completely, purchased with money earned from her seamstress work and Wyatt's steady support. More importantly, it was a place where they could exist, openly without shadows or secrets. "Tea's ready," Wyatt called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the comfortable familiarity of routine established over months of shared evenings. She turned to find him in the doorway, sleeves rolled up from washing dishes, hair slightly mussed, from the day's work. The badge still glinted on his chest, but it no longer seemed to define him. If anything, he had redefined it, shown the town what law enforcement could look like when guided by compassion rather than rigid adherence to rules. "How was the council meeting?" she asked, accepting the cup he offered. "Same as always. Henderson still finding things to complain about, Mrs. Pemberton still convinced that moral decay is imminent." His smile was wry but not bitter. "But they can't argue with results. Crime's down. People feel safer, and the territorial governor complimented our community stability in his last report." The transformation hadn't been without cost. Some families still crossed the street when they saw her, still whispered behind fans and curtains about the sheriff's unusual charity. But others had embraced her, the families whose children she taught to read, the women who brought her sewing work, the men who tipped their hats and called her Miss Hartwell with genuine respect. "Thomas wants to know if you'll help him build a treehouse," she said, settling beside him on the porch steps. "Does he now?" Wyatt's eyes found the boy in the garden, and she saw affection in his expression that made her chest warm with contentment. "I suppose I could spare some lumber and expertise." They sat in comfortable silence, watching darkness gather around the edges of their small, perfect world. In her pocket, Eliza carried the wooden horse her father had carved, not as a reminder of loss, but as a promise that love persisted, that families could be rebuilt on foundations of choice rather than blood. "Eliza," Wyatt said quietly, his hand finding hers in the gathering dusk. "Yes?" "I love you." The words settled between them like seeds finding fertile ground, simple and profound, and completely without surprise. She had known for months, had felt it in the way he looked at her, the care he took with Thomas, the gentle revolution he had orchestrated in his own life to make room for theirs. "I love you too," she replied, the confession as natural as breathing. Above them the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, Thomas called for them to come see the constellation he had discovered. They rose, together, Wyatt's hand warm in hers, and walked into the garden where her brother waited with the patient trust that had sustained them all. In the space between starlight and shadow, Eliza felt the last pieces of her carefully guarded heart settle into place. She was no longer the desperate girl who had crouched behind a sheriff's desk, stealing medicine and hope in equal measure. She was no longer the woman who lived in the margins, existing on charity and careful distances. She was Eliza Hartwell, beloved and belonging, her roots growing deep in soil she had helped to make fertile. The transformation was complete, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of days when she woke without fear, when Thomas laughed without looking over his shoulder, when Wyatt came home to them as naturally as rivers returning to the sea. The wooden horse in her pocket caught the moonlight as she pulled it out, its carved surface smooth beneath her fingers, a reminder not of what was lost, but of what endured, what could be passed down and passed on. Someday she would give it to Thomas, and he would carry forward the story of their father's hands, their family's love, the long journey from shadow into light. For now it was enough to stand in their garden, surrounded by the two men who had chosen to love her, watching. Stars emerge in the vast darkness above. It was enough to have survived, to have chosen courage over safety, trust over fear. It was enough to be home.